Off Transport and Infrastructure Committee meeting round 8 to 5. Welcome to all member councillors as well as a visiting Deputy Mayor and Councillor Hamill. We've got no apologies at all, we've got no leave of absence. If we confirmation of minutes, if we can have someone move those. Moved by Councillor Vorster, seconded by Councillor Peter Young. All those in favour? Thank you. Conflict of interest declarations, I haven't received any at all, so we're right. Okay, all good to go forward. Councillors, we've got one starred item, 5.1, and then unstarred items, we've got 6.1, 6.2, 6.3 and 7.1. To use a fellow councillor's words, is there an appetite to star any of those? 7.1, starring 7.1. Councillors, did we have any questions on 7.1? One. All right. Well, we'll just go through all others. Now, all other items 6.1, 6.2 and 6.3 have a presentation available should the councillors want it. Other than that, we can just go through the agenda and decide at the time. So 5.1 still starred. If we could have a mover. Moved by Councillor Taylor, seconded by Councillor Owen Jones. All those in favour? That's carried. Okay, so we'll go to 6.1 and the ferry expansion update.
If you need to speak, it's on there. Three, Madam Chair. I'll introduce Daniel McNaught, who's been our project manager for the Hoppo ferry system, amongst other public transport partnership initiatives we've had for the last wee while, doing a sterling job. So Danny's got some information, and we're happy to field questions as we go. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks. Through the chair, thank you, Matt. So, councillors, thank you for the opportunity to present agenda item 6.1 today, which, as Matt just alluded to, is an update in relation to the Gold Coast Ferry expansion and the investigations undertaken by officers. Is that working? All good? Yep, awesome. So, by way of background, this agenda item has come about as a result of a council resolution from council meeting round 815 earlier this year. So the resolution specifically stated that council authorise the Director of Transport and Infrastructure to work in partnership with the current contractor to investigate the merits of expanding the service area and report back to council in December 2022 with the findings. So in response to this resolution, council officers have undertaken an investigation into potential areas to expand the service to, and as well as that, we've also engaged with the service provider to understand their thoughts and position on expansion of the service. So as shown on the screen at the moment, we've identified 4 potential areas for expansion. We've looked at the locations to the north, as shown in the red shading between Labrador and Paradise Point. We've looked at internal expansion within the current service area, which is shown in the yellow shading. And then we've also looked south from Surfers Paradise through to Broadbeach, shown in the green, and then west from Surfers Paradise through to Carrara, Metricon Stadium type area. So in relation to our investigations, when we looked at the southern area, at the moment it's not possible for the ferry to be expanded into that location because the Monaco Street Bridge doesn't have the necessary clearance for the ferry to travel in that direction. So unfortunately it's not an option at present to travel to the south. In relation to the west, we looked at potential locations to have future stops being Carrara Markets, Royal Pines and Metricon Stadium. It was considered that these locations have a limited demand, particularly on the basis that they're primarily event-based attractors. So in terms of a regular service, there would be limited ongoing demand. In addition to that, there's also a long travel time to these locations. It's approximately 55 minutes, going 6 knots the entire way. So we didn't deem it to be feasible and appropriate to expand to this location at this point in time. In relation to the existing service corridor, we looked at potential pontoons that are currently within the existing service corridor, and those locations are Proud Park Main Beach near the Sundial Bridge, as well as Stadium Drive Main Beach, which is currently under construction at the moment. In both instances, it was determined that these locations have limited ongoing regular demand at the moment, again, because they're primarily weekend or recreational trips with limited demand at present or limited density in that location for passengers. So what we are suggesting is that those locations will be appropriate at the moment for event purposes, and then maybe longer term down the track may be appropriate to add in as additional stops. The final area investigated was to the north. So we looked at 3 potential stops at Labrador, near Charis Seafood, the Runaway Bay Shopping Centre, and then Paradise Point. When looking at these locations, what we know about the ferry at present is that the primary trips being undertaken are tourist-based and recreational-based. There's limited commuter demand at this point in time. So with that in mind, given that there is a smaller tourist market in this area, we had concerns that there wouldn't necessarily be a lot of demand to expand to this location at this point in time. So what we did in response to that was then we went and started having the conversations with the service provider. So in conversations with the service provider, their position at this point in time is that their focus is to continue building momentum. The service is still relatively new. It's only been operating for approximately 3 years and has been significantly affected by COVID during that time. So their current focus is on continuing to build patronage, continuing to build awareness for the service. They did advise that any expansion would require 2 new vessels at significant cost. And at present, they're not in a position to expand the service and invest in the new ferries without some sort of financial assistance from a third party, or if there was a significant increase in patronage that would help offset those additional costs. So with that in mind, at this point in time, we're not recommending expansion of the service. We're suggesting that the focus be on continuing to grow the awareness of the ferry and continuing to grow the current service corridor, getting the patronage numbers up even higher than they already are, and then reconsidering expansion of the service in the future upon request from the service provider. Thanks.
Councillors, questions at all? I'll go to Councillor Caldwell first, then I'll go to Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, through you, Madam Chair. When does the contract with Hoppo end?
Through the chair, so at meeting round 815 earlier this year, we were endorsed to enter into a new contract with them, and so we have recently entered into a new contract which is for 5 years.
Okay.
And there is an option to extend.
Yeah, cool. I note that obviously some of it's good, but it's also limiting because we can't actually really affect any change to the routes without their agreement. Is that the way it works, basically?
Through the chair, correct.
Yeah. And also that they have exclusivity over the route, like no other commercial operator can use the same stops and route or something. Is that right?
Through Madam Chair, my understanding, and Danny might correct me if I'm wrong here, is that they've got exclusive use for commercial activity on those particular stops. There are other areas within the vicinity of the service area that we've investigated that we could investigate another provider, but where the origin destination of the current service pattern is, they do have an exclusive commercial contract there.
Okay, cool. On page 25, where it says the projected patronage is supported by findings of the commuter ferry trial in November 2021, which demonstrated there is limited commuter demand for a ferry service at present, with it being primarily used for tourist and recreational purposes. Now that comment is in the section that relates to the northern area, but was that comment from the ferry trial relating to the whole of the service, or did it specifically relate to the section, the northern section? Is that like, is it an overall comment?
Through the chair. Yeah,
Yeah, you go.
sorry, Danny. Yes, it is.
Okay. And then I had one more question. I didn't read anywhere in the report what you had just put up on the screen about the fact that they had said that they might be willing to do it, for example, if there was a capital contribution towards vessels. Did I miss that, or is it not in there?
Through Madam Chair, at the base of page 27, Councillor, there's a couple of dot points that summarises what Danielle spoke to just before.
So, oh, sorry. So those ones are general, not just in relation to central. Sorry, I misread that.
Through the chair, correct.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And when you're looking at other destinations, I'm talking about the southern route, Via Roma, some of those areas, I mean, were those particular points looked at? And I'm looking at the potential of locals that actually got access to the service as you went down that stream?
Yep, I'll answer that. Yeah, through the chair, we did look at Via Roma. It was packaged in with the expansion to the south investigations. So it wasn't looked at as potentially a standalone, like small extension. It was packaged in with the southern expansion.
Do you mind if I add that? Thank you, Danny. Through Madam Chair, really the feedback we've had from the current providers that any expansion at the moment will trigger their performing really well given circumstances over the past number of months, if not year or two. I don't think we would completely write off an opportunity at a point in the future, hopefully not too distant future, where they might be able to, in a position where we can contemplate an expanded service within some of the options that Danielle's documented through the report and the presentation. Perhaps for events, it might be a gradual evolution of an expanded service initially, as opposed to a substantial system enhancement like we've investigated as part of this piece of work.
Councillor Hamill.
Madam Chair, I was just interested, so there's a bit of a breakdown on page 28 that's got some trip data, and it's averaged it out to per month and per day, but I was just interested if the officers could tell me what the numbers looked more like Monday to Friday versus on the weekends.
Yeah, through the chair, I don't have that data on me at the moment, so I'd be guessing if I was to say something. Weekdays are certainly popular times for the service, so it's not the standard commuter peak periods that we're seeing with the ferry. We're seeing weekday trips are very popular because of the recreational element and tourist element of it as well. So weekdays certainly busy off peak, and then obviously weekends as well. Sundays are certainly a busy day for the service also.
And it's where you've come in a roundabout way to where my line of thought was is on the weekend, is it tourists visiting the city or is it residents of the city using it as a tourist experience?
Through you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Danny. It's a combination, Councillor. It's a combination of visitors who are residents of the city who are using it as an experience that they might not have had before as well. So the anecdotal data from the operator is that there are a lot of Gold Coast residents using it. I think in 815, Danny, I think we gave an overview whereby there is a fair proportion of non-city visitors, but there's also quite a high number of Gold Coast residents using it for non-commuter recreational purposes as well.
Yeah. And so, Matt, these numbers that are in here, so they've averaged it out to 167 trips a day. Is a trip an individual person, or is, if there's a family of 5, is that counted as one trip?
Through the chair, individual person.
So 167 persons a day. Yep.
Councillor Caldwell.
Just one more, Madam Chair. What's our next points in time at which we're going to have reports back to council on numbers, patronage data?
So through the chair, there's an existing resolution that will report back at the 5-year mark of the contract, but no other formal proposal at this point in time.
Okay. I've got an alternative resolution, Madam Chair, which I don't know where I send that to these days. What's the... So when the time comes, Madam Chair, if I could speak to it, I just wouldn't mind us tracking the numbers a bit more closely and earlier than the 5 years is one of the actions. And I think it's also important that at this point in time we record some of the reasons to explain to the community why there's no expansion. And fair enough, there's feasibility issues about bridges and what have you. But the other thing is that we just need to accept that this is currently being successful as a tourist operation, not as a commuter operation. So I know that there was a great deal of anticipation in the north of the city that this might lead to something more expansive, but it clearly is not going to be in the short term. So basically, the words on the screen are something along the lines of what I'd like to move when you're ready to accept motions.
And I'll get Councillor Young
Thanks, Madam
to
Chair.
second that if you wanted to speak to it.
Yeah, I'll speak to it briefly, even though I just sort of gave a prelim speaking to it. Obviously, it's a little bit disappointing that the ferry trial hasn't got us to a point where we can expand the network, both within the existing footprint and further afield. It just goes to illustrate the difficulties of on-water solutions for transport, and lots of people come up to us as councillors and say, why aren't we using our waterways? And the reality is they're slower, it's more expensive, and at the moment it's really only a tourism experience. So I think we just need to be alert to the realities of that for the time being. But I would like to just monitor those numbers because I don't really want to just leave it unchecked for 5 years. I would rather, and I've suggested that we come back, say, in 12 months' time, and I don't know whether the officers have a view on, whether at that time we'll just be able to do a quick desktop analysis of what the numbers are, what it's looking like, are we tracking better, are we tracking worse, so that we have a journey that we can go on as far as the life of this particular sort of transport option is concerned. So that's the basis of what I'm trying to achieve here today.
And I think actually that's not such a bad idea because we've had 2 years of COVID data as such where there was a lot of changed conditions within the city, and I think if we can get a year or 2 years or going forward data that is more business as usual, then we'll be able to make future decisions. So
Through Madam Chair, thank you, Councillor. I think it's a good idea, and I think I just wonder whether the council would like an update, less outside of a report, an update on the performance of some of our, our public transport partnerships. So we've got the bike hire scheme as well. We're about to have the Northern Bus Service Improvement Initiative as well. So we've got some, some well thought through skin in the game with some public transport offerings throughout the city at the moment. I wouldn't be unhappy about bringing to you, not that we did a couple of weeks ago, an update every 6 months, 12 months, depending on what your appetite is for around the performance of some of those elements of our public transport system, to give you confidence that we are getting value for money for our investment in these schemes and that they are achieving the desired outcomes that we set out to achieve with those. So, obviously for the committee's decision, but more than happy to bring a periodical update to the committee if that would help.
actually, Matt, I think that'd be a great idea because it's we are all speaking the active transport initiatives within the city and also with our, I've seen, Darren, I'll come to you, and we've seen all of the conversation around the light rail and how we're looking at that style of thing. So I think, you know, with our bikes and all those other schemes coming forward, that it's actually good that we're all over that. So, yeah, I think I'd appreciate that, and I think the rest of the councillors would too.
What we might have a think about, Chair, is actually bringing together, we've got the State of the Network presentation coming to the next committee and actually trying to bring some of that stuff together so we have the different components. So we'll do this one separately, Matt, and then I think maybe we'll try and bring them together ongoing. Good.
Councillor Taylor and then
Thank-
Councillor Owen-Jones.
Thank you. And obviously the feel is how can our locals use this service moving forward, but it does go to Surfers Paradise as an area where we do have residents. Is there a way that we can understand who's using it, let's say Surfers Paradise 4217, and if they're using it for public or tourists, so that we can get an understanding of the people that have got access, is it being used for that particular transport service?
I think through you, Madam Chair, with the support of the committee, I think we can continue. We do work very closely with Hoppo, and they're a good partner, can I say, in this space. We do work on making sure that we do have our finger to the pulse around the demographic and the user group, whether it's repeat users, new users and whatnot. So as part of, whether it's as part of the State of the Network report or at a point in time soon thereafter where we might be able to give the committee a bit of a cross-section of those user groups and the user types and whatnot. It's the type of metrics that are of interest to me and certainly to Daniel as well around, not just the customer sentiment, but also the repeated use, the new use, the way in which we can sharpen our below-the-line marketing of these great products to make sure that we are tapping into new user groups as well. So I think it's a good idea. We can certainly ask the question of Hoppo about what information, what data they collect and what they are, I guess, happy for us to share with the committee, perhaps maybe in a closed session, maybe, if there's some data in there that is quite granular by its nature, but certainly we use that information in the partnering meetings that we have with Hoppo and some of our other public transport providers to try and sharpen that marketing and make sure it's tapping into that we've got sustained usage from customers, but we also got new customers as well. So I think it's a good idea. Thank you.
Councillor Owen-Jones.
Thank you. So through you, I'm not too sure if it's in the suggested report of the state of the network, but I think it's important that we get as much data from the state government in regards to their public transport networks as well, because I think this report talks of 150 or 160 daily trips on Hoppo. Clearly it pales in significance in regards to the volume of people using light rail and bus, and so I think it's important that we don't get too bogged down on the peripheral in regards to the transport options. So the more information we get from the state, the better.
Councillors, so the change recommendations there moved by Councillor Caldwell, seconded by Councillor Peter Young. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to... Very good, yes. And thanks, Daniel. Great presentation. Appreciate it. Councillors, item 6.2, City Plan Off-Street Car Parking Rates Assessment, Project Progress Update. Is this you again? Daniel.
Similarly, I'll introduce you to Daniel Nord, who's through Madam Chair. Daniel's
Daniel, wearer of hats, yes. Thanks,
many
Daniel.
hats, but certainly these are two projects. We thought we'd give them a double treat today. Two projects that Daniel's been working very hard on for the last period of time. So we do have a brief presentation to explain some further detail that we thought might have been a little bit too granular for the actual report, but we're certainly happy to with your blessing, for Daniel to go through those slides and then to accept any questions and have a discussion after there. Thank you.
Through the chair. So item 6.2 relates to an update on the City Plan Off-Street Car Parking Rates Assessment Project. So by way of background, this project commenced off the back of an existing action within the City Parking Plan, so Action 5.7, which is that we undertake a review of the City Plan Transport Code to identify opportunities for improving the provision of off-street car parking within developments. So the purpose of this project is to review off-street car parking rates prescribed in the City Plan. So when we're referring to off-street car parking rates, we're talking about the number of car parks that a developer is required to provide when submitting a development application to council under the City Plan. So councillors, you may recall myself and my coordinator met with you all earlier this year to provide an update on this project, and We also sought your feedback on any existing issues, problems or feedback that you have in relation to off-street car parking and existing developments or land uses in your area. As part of that engagement, we also met with internal stakeholders from our city development, city planning, transport assessment, development compliance and transport and traffic branches as well. And that feedback was then collated, and that has gone into what we're terming the situation paper, which is the first deliverable of stage 1 of this project. So the situation paper is essentially a detailed review and analysis of all existing car parking rates under the city plan, so for each land use, with the idea being that we would have a set of recommendations for each land use following that review. So the situation paper, what we have asked our consultant to do is essentially they've broken down all land uses into, they've placed them into one of 3 categories. So the first category is that there's an existing land use that we can recommend to be changed based on the information we have available at present. The second category is that there's certain land uses that require further work, which we propose to do in the form of parking surveys as part of stage 2. And then finally, the third category is that there's a group of land uses that don't require any change based on the review undertaken. So where we are at is, as shown on the screen here, in relation to land uses that we're recommending rate changes to without any further work required. We've identified 6 at this point in time, 6 as shown on the screen there. So these land uses have been identified. So there were 3, I suppose, criteria that we considered for all land uses. How did the existing rate compare with other councils? How did the existing rate compare with existing data that we have available for that specific land use? And then thirdly, how did it compare with known issues that we have locally here on the Gold Coast? Did the rate appropriately address any of those issues that we have? So we've identified 6 that we are recommending at this point in time that can be changed without any further work. So in relation to further work required, so what we've identified is that there's 14 land uses that we're suggesting further work is needed to be undertaken for, which we're proposing in the form of car parking surveys. I won't go into all 14, but some of the land uses of note that you'll be interested to hear about is multiple dwellings. It has been identified as a land use to undertake parking surveys for, so we're suggesting there may be potential to increase the existing rate, but we would like to get some data to verify what's currently happening and then what will be appropriate. So other land uses of note based on some of the engagement that we've undertaken with yourselves. So we've got educational establishments in there, primary school, high schools, food and drink outlet, and then over the page as well, childcare centres are also included as well. So in relation to, sorry. So again, these land uses we're proposing to undertake surveys for, which suggests that the rate, either we didn't have enough information to determine that the existing rate is working and appropriate, and so we want to get more data to verify that in the form of parking surveys. So just in closing quickly, the next steps for the project from here is that we're going to go and collect parking surveys for those 14 land uses that we've identified further work needs to be undertaken for. And we've also identified that there's another package of further work relating to the Southport PDA, the centre zones and the transport hub. So at present there was limited data relating to the rates that are applicable in those locations, and so we've suggested that a separate package of work will be undertaken to have a bit of a closer look at those rates specifically. And then finally, once that work's undertaken, sorry, do you want me to keep going? Yeah, keep going? Sorry, I'll be 10 seconds. So once we've collected the parking survey data and undertaken that final review relating to the transport hub information, we'll then kick into stage 3 of the project, which is to develop a final recommendations paper, which will have all land uses and a final recommendation attached to that, which is proposed for late next year, early 2024.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. If we could go back to maybe the second slide, at least the one that referred to the city parking plan and its action item. So I remember this plan, and I talk about this plan quite a bit with my community, particularly, you know, in light of council's decision to dispose of Bruce Bishop. What I've attempted to do was to provide some confidence to the community that, at least with respect to private development, that we'd be taking steps to provide more car parking off-street. And that's why at the time, well, in anticipation of what could happen with Bruce Bishop, I was happy to support the city parking plan. But I must admit, when I read that action item, it says here, undertake a review of the city plan transport code to identify opportunities for improving the provision of off-street car parking within developments. At no time did I contemplate that we would have a body of work or a report that would suggest decreasing in any way the provision of car parking, off-street car parking within developments. Now, I could be wrong, maybe my colleagues have got a different interpretation than I'd have, but I'm very, for my own sake, very troubled that what was a very narrow action item in the city parking plan was read so liberally. I would have much preferred to see city officers focus on, through their engagement with councillors, identifying those land uses where we know there's insufficient car parking, and to focus on addressing those as quickly as possible. Now, that's not to say that there are, you know, that there aren't sensible things that we should be doing. I know childcare centres, I think we've talked in the past of there being some over-provision, but I would never have thought that we would have had a body of work that would have contemplated reductions, because I would have deemed that out of scope. Also think it's concerning on the back, and I could be completely wrong here, colleagues, but many of us are familiar with parts of the Gold Coast where there is a chronic undersupply of off-street car parking. And I don't know how many times I've banged on about Varsity Lakes and the issues there. I feel like I'm like Daphne with Palm Beach, or, you know, Donna with Narrow Streets in Pimpama, or now Mark, or whatever it is, or Cameron with boat ramps. Clearways. You know, very concerning that there appears foreshadowed in the report an appetite, almost a presumption, to look at reducing the supply of off-street car parking in these areas. I think Nerang, Bundall, certainly Varsity Lakes jumped off the page to me. When, to go back to the slide, the direction was undertake a review of the city plan transport code to identify opportunities for improving the provision of off-street car parking within development. So my question is it the city officer view that by reducing the amount of off-street car parking, we can improve the provision of off-street car parking? That's my first question.
Through you, Madam Chair. I read that literally, and it's improving the provision. So the highest and best use of space in the city is not to have empty car parks around developments where we know we don't need the demand there. So I take your points, Councillor Vorster, they're all very well made. I've supported the officers through this process in creating a very strong evidence base, based on land use and based on geography within the city, to make sure that we can provide yourselves and your constituents and our colleagues in EPE with confidence that we know a lot more than what we did historically about the provisions within the Transport Code, to make sure we were trying to marry up likely demands based on evidence of what those land uses and places within the city were and are, based on the type of provision for that off-street space. Now, the balance of that action, if I can just draw council's attention to the committee's attention to that, is it also says, and to optimise the utilisation of adjacent on-street parking space during the application approval process. So this is where the guys have had to be smart in managing the scope of this piece of work, because it does look at the off-street rates, and it does look at it based on the type of land use, and some of these types of land use that we're dealing with through the DA process now, I understand with working with Roger and the team in city development, they are not traditional land uses. Some of them are land uses that have emerged over time, and they are surfing the definition of what has historically been part of our planning scheme. So I can't but support the team and Danny and Nick and the team to make sure that we are trying to develop a body of evidence to provide the committee with what we believe is the right solution, as opposed to what could be perceived to be an oversupply or undersupply based on certain types of land use and geography within the city. It's my role, and I hope it still is my role, to make sure that I provide you with that informed decision so that we can have a conversation at committee that contemplates the highest and best use of space within the city, knowing that car parking does take up an extraordinary amount of space in the city.
Madam Chair, I humbly submit, very humbly, because I'm only one person sitting around this table and only one person in the chamber. But I humbly submit that valuable city officer time is best directed where the council directs it. And when I voted to support the City Parking Plan 2031, it was on the basis that valuable city officer time would be directed at the very worthwhile endeavour of improving the provision of off-street car parking within developments. I fully acknowledge that there may be circumstances where particular land uses might demand a rethink. I totally accept that. But given what I feel is the community urgency around addressing present inadequacies, my feeling, my understanding at the time is that that's where your time was going to be focused. It is your role, as far as I understand, to provide that frank, fearless and comprehensive advice that allows us to make fully informed decisions, but it's also our role to direct how your time is spent by council resolution, and in my mind that's where it should have been. Madam Chair, my second question just relates to the use of a consultant, and I don't want the consultant named because I don't want to trigger any DCOIs, but I am interested in whether that was a traffic consultant or whether it was a town planning consultant, and whether there was more than one consultant engaged.
Through Madam Chair, through a competitive tender process, we engaged a consultant who has experience working with both the public sector and private sector in both the traffic and development assessment industry. Again, through a competitive tender process based on a request for proposal, it was, I think from memory, Daniel, it was a fairly standout proposal in terms of value for money, but also immediately available intelligence that this particular consultant was able to apply to the process, from both looking at it from both a public transport, if I can say not public transport, but public transport system utilisation perspective, but also from a development industry perspective as well. So,
Madam Chair, I suppose my follow-up question is this. My personal view is that the property development sector, for purely commercial interest, basically torpedoed City Plan Amendment Package 2 and 3 in their entirety. That's my sense of it, because they had overwhelming vested interests in maximising the development yield on behalf of their clients. And quite often, as a community representative, I'm left with the job of unscrambling an egg where those developers have used their rights under the city plan to push ahead with certain development outcomes. So I'd like a sense, through you, Madam Chair, to you, Matt, to what extent were the consultants engaged providing policy suggestions, and to what extent were they simply there to gather data so that your team, as those who write the report, could develop the policy response yourselves?
Sure. Through Madam Chair, thank you, Councillor Vorster. So I might get Danny, if you don't mind, just to back end my response. I'm aware that the consultant was engaged to do a myriad of things, including benchmark with other local government areas with industry best practice, both locally, regionally, nationally, etc., and so on. Collect data to verify or validate in benchmarking industry best practice for the Gold Coast context, to then work with us as a project team, Daniel, Nick, etc., and so on, to form an opinion about how best to take forward the marriage of industry best practice with the Gold Coast, the unique characteristics of the Gold Coast land use and transport system. So a combination of what I think what you've said, Councillor Vorster, was what they were engaged to do. We also have an internal project governance system where we do work closely with EPE to make sure that we are tapping into the intelligence that EPE does have with regard to the trends in the development industry as well. So I'd like to think, through the work that the project team has done, is that we've tried to cover as many bases as possible. Dan, I don't know whether you need to add anything to that one.
So,
I just might go to
please,
the
Madam
director
Chair.
first, or acting director, just to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I might just quickly jump in. So I've obviously been doing my own due diligence on this process as well, Councillor. So from my perspective, I think the work the officers have undertaken was going to be the same regardless of the outcome. I think there was a decision and everyone was comfortable with the methodology about looking at each of the individual land uses. And obviously at this point we've come to a situational paper, and there are a couple that are surprisingly decreasing, but at the moment that is a situational paper. From my perspective, we've now got to do some more work on the evidence-based components, and then absolutely we will be coming back with a recommendation that should be alleviating those concerns and relying on consultants. It should be about the evidence and the information that we've collated, and it will be recommendations for you to consider.
Thanks, Director.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for facilitating that contribution from the Director. I would just like to, for whatever it's worth, caution any process to take us down the path of potential reductions in the provision of off-street car parking without properly getting a sense of where the elected officials may be, not because we in the chamber might scupper the progression of this work, but rather because amending the transport code requires an amendment of the planning scheme and ultimately will demand community consultation. And I can't imagine, it comes like I'm Doctor Strange in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm trying to imagine every possible reality which might exist, but I can't land on a reality which may exist where the community supports a reduction in the provision of off-street car parking. And I think it's really important that city officers recalibrate their appetite to look at reductions, because it could be that your valuable time is spent on an update to the transport code, which is not ultimately supported by the public and therefore canned at the end of the process when we've got so much other work to be done with sorting out the city plan. But my last question is about lawn bowls. This is one where you propose to increase, right? Now, this is one where I'd probably say there's probably no case or need to increase them, only because my local bolo is struggling. It is absolutely struggling, and it's on its knees. And I think we just need to be careful with developments, particularly community developments like your community centres and all the rest that provide vital social infrastructure in our communities, making it more expensive and difficult for them to function and be sustainable. And I suppose that's a caution, and I'd just like to get a sense of what may have driven that. Was that a councillor suggestion? Did it come from the consultants? Or do we have a body of evidence that says bowls clubs are causing, traffic chaos in adjacent narrow streets?
Through the chair, so for that specific land use, it came down to, again, reviewing those three criteria that we mentioned, so comparing with other councils. looking at existing demand data that we had available for that land use, and then based on information and feedback we got through the stakeholder engagement process. So specifically for that land use, we are proposing a minor increase based on a comparison with the other councils, as well as some demand data that we had available as well. So it was backed by data, as well as a comparison with other rates.
And sorry, Madam Chair, I really apologise for this. Can I just get a sense, maybe you're across it, but when we do a comparison with other local governments, are we attempting to meet the average of the other local governments, or are we attempting to meet the highest rate amongst those local governments? So I appreciate we're trying to do a comparison, but having done the comparison, where are we trying to land in the spectrum? Do you know?
No, I'll go to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks.
If I could, thank you, through Madam Chair. I answer in a macro sense, Danny, and then I'll let you answer specifically for this one. When we benchmark regularly, councillors, with other councils, not to cut and paste, but to see how the other councils have evolved their policy frameworks in line with their, say in this instance, off-street parking policy frameworks, in line with their broader either transport strategy, desired outcomes, or other elements of their transport policy framework as well. So in a roundabout way, we don't look, there's always a range. There's always a range, councillors. Some councils, some local governments are more, should we say, more aggressive with their policy interventions. Some are more passive. So we certainly don't, I think we look at the beyond just the metric and see how it marries up with their transport policy, the scale of their city as well. We certainly don't just look up the road. We look into state, we look at other SEQ councils and other regional councils in particularly New South Wales, Victoria and up the coast as well. So from a macro point of view, councillors, we look at it beyond just the metric of the actual benchmark. We look at to more how it marries up with their broader transport policy and how consistent or inconsistent that is with our transport strategy as well. I'll flick to Danny now with this specific example.
So through the chair, so we benchmarked against 10 other comparable councils, and so for this particular land use, it's probably easiest to say we looked at all 10, and if there was, say, an average, we'd understand how our rate compared with that average, if we were in the higher end of the spectrum, if we were at the lower end, and that helps us then understand how we compare.
Sorry, so were we attempting to meet the average? Is that basically the answer to my question?
No, not attempting to meet the average. So
I think
it helped us understand if there was an average, are we above the average, under the average, to help us. That just then helped us understand how we met that criteria or how we compared in that one criteria. So if we were high, that might suggest that that's something we need to look at more. If we were low, that suggests that something's off and we need to have a closer look at this rate.
Go down the line. Councillor Sally, okay at the moment? Yes, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I've got a question about tandem car parking. So currently the city plan is silent on the efficiency of use of a tandem versus a double car park. And I've had meetings with our planning officers about this.
It's just out of scope for this, this particular.
So can that be in scope? Because it has a significant impact.
.34 of the agenda, thanks Danny. There's a number of things that I do want to be in scope eventually for this project. So this is, like I said, this is another piece of work that will progressively be attacked over the next 12 plus months around the emergence of these, or the often unique characteristics of off-street car parking spaces. You can see there's about 10 or so dot points there around things that
on
for
page
now...
34. On
page 34, thank you. Yeah, we've consciously put to the side for now to try and get the land use and the geography of the city evidence in place so we can put those initial thoughts forward, and then we can start approaching some of these more detailed elements at a future point in time, hopefully not too far away.
Through the chair, can I just add to that too, Councillor Patterson? You did raise that in the stakeholder engagement process when we met with you, and that's why it ended up in being flagged as a project that requires further investigation into the future.
Thank you. It does seem quite different to all the rest of those that are out of scope, though, which is it actively right now is defined as a car space for a car in the city plan. None of those other out of scope points are. But the reality is, I don't know what the percentage is, but people do not use it to the same capacity as the double. So I get why all those others are there as an out of scope. I don't get why tandem is, though, because it impacts so much. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor Peter Young. Thank you.
So can I just ask a question about this in scope and out of scope? Because I don't understand how you can read that resolution and say that that particular item that Councillor Patterson has raised is, you've read that to be out of scope, but you've read that improvements means also reducing. You know what I mean? Like, and I thought I raised that in our stakeholder meeting as well. And so I don't understand, at that point in time, it seemed like it was in scope because we raised it. So then there must have been a later decision point that arose that said, well, no, actually that feedback, even though it's been received, is actually out of scope. So do we...
I think what we might do, Councillor Street, Chair, I don't disagree with what you're saying, and we've got Australian standards for off-street spaces that we need to perhaps to as well, AS 2890.2, I think it is. So we need to be aware of what our ability is to disallow certain layouts of off-street car parking spaces through this piece of work. So if you don't mind, if you can take that question on notice, please, councillors, and come back and see.
The only reason I say that is because specifically on that point, and I'm sorry, Madam Chair, for skipping the queue, but it's on this point. I think the solution that I had suggested was that maybe, and this goes directly to the rate of parking provided, not the configuration and the dimensions in the Australian standards. It's about, okay, well, maybe a tandem park should only count for 0.5 of a park. Now, to me, that should be directly feeding into this work, not sitting outside it. So sorry for cutting in, Madam Chair, but I'm just a little bit at a loss as to how we arrived at this point.
You just said my exact point. If we could look at 0.5, that would be...
I'll go to Councillor Peter Young.
Thanks, Chair. At the top of page 36, I just want to refer to a statement there which is talking about reconsidering allowing reduced rates in centre zones outside of the transport hub, e.g. Nerang. What does that mean precisely, please?
So through the chair, so in the centre zones under the city plan at present, we have reduced rates in some locations such as Nerang, Coomera, Bundall, and so we are...
Which is a blanket that applies to all development or just specific development within the centre zone?
Within the centre zones, so it's broken down into, I think it's residential and non-residential, but I'd have to have a closer look at that. But what we're saying there is the feedback we got through the stakeholder process from some councillors as well as internal stakeholders was that having a reduced rate in some of those locations that aren't supported by public transport, high frequency public transport in particular within walking distance, has suggested that those currently reduced rates may not be meeting the demand in those locations.
Thanks very much. I agree. And
Furiously.
I just had a second question, which is about residential development, just in the burbs sort of thing. Frequently there's complaints and concerns raised about car parking, inadequate car parking provision in those areas, and that's been strongly incentivised by the clampdown on illegal car parking, people parking on the verge and so forth. Typically we would always have a car parking rate for domestic dwellings. Things change over a period of time. The young kids grow up, have cars, and people buy boats and caravans, and all of a sudden the street is full of cars with toys. And it seems that maybe our residential car parking rates aren't keeping pace or aren't realistic for today's conditions, but that's not considered at all in this, as I see it. If
I can, Madam Chair, I'll just turn that into, I'll try and respond to the point made, Councillor Young, which is a good one, and it's very much front and centre of a lot of the work we're doing in this space. Can I just suggest that as part of that data and the evidence that we're building is to acknowledging what's happening now as opposed to what's happened 10, 20 years ago. So we are trying to get that evidence base of how the use of a combination of the off-street development space, but also how it then interacts with the on-street space is working now. That's the body of evidence that we're trying to build to, again, as I said before, to allow a conversation to improve that provision of off-street car parking in developments.
Yeah, I appreciate that we can't retrofit those suburbs. Those things have emerged over a period of time, and they're likely to emerge in the new suburbs and new developments that we're creating now. So with that foresight, we should be able to ensure that the car parking rates that we apply now to those residential developments are anticipating what the future might be. And maybe that people have less cars in the future, I don't know. Is there anything that's looking at that?
So through the chair, so we did look at dwelling houses as part of the review. So the current standard requirement is that they're typically providing 2 spaces per dwelling house. The feedback we've received is that rate is working at present. We haven't considered increasing that rate at this point in time. It's something we will get data relating to multiple dwellings, which I recognise is more unit complexes, so there's different characteristics with that. If we were to increase the rate for a dwelling house based on what it currently is, I think that would be that'd be a big decision for us to have to take into account to go beyond 2 spaces per dwelling. So it's not something that I think we've looked at in a lot of detail at this point in time, but we certainly can.
That you said that the feedback is that it's working, and the feedback I get is that it's not. And I'm just thinking about, well, in 20 years' time, the stuff that we're creating now, are we just replicating the problem, or do we make a bold move and try to anticipate more realistically, based on what we do know now, what might happen in the future? So I would be supportive of a detailed sort of, pardon me, review of those car parking rates for residential. Sorry, something in my throat.
Councillor Caldwell, did you have any questions?
I might have snuck in earlier, I think. But let me just think about that while the opportunity arises.
Why don't I go while you look?
You go. Yeah.
Go to Councillor Gates, and thank you.
But keep looking for your next
Yeah,
question. Sorry, I can't help but agree mainly with Councillor Vorster that the intent of that resolution was not understood. I wanted to know, you mentioned 10 councils as being similar. I don't see anyone else being similar to this city, and I'd love to know what the 10 councils, where they were located, because we have 13 million visitors a year. It's a very different proposition to most other cities in Australia. So how do we compare our situation with other councils? I don't get that. So where were they, if you don't mind?
Through Madam Chair, I'll come back to Danny. You can say the exact 10. Traditionally, when we've done benchmarking over the years that I've been involved in these projects, we do look at a mix of local government areas that are high growth, which is one similar characteristic, which have a high degree of transient population, which is another characteristic, which does ideally not have a CBD focus. I mean, Brisbane's an obvious one where we look up the road because of some of the policies they have there and the effect that they have regionally, but we try to have a more generically, I'm sorry to answer in generic sense again, Councillor, but we usually try to get a mix of LGAs that have similar characteristics, not holistically, because as you said, there's no city the same as the Gold Coast, but ones that have characteristics that do mirror some of the unique characteristics that we do have as a city as well.
See, the population at Brisbane, you couldn't compare what happens there with here, and now being a linear city as we are, I just can't think of similar circumstances, especially in terms of our limited public transport, that how you can possibly mark, one against the other. And I would really, I'm not on this committee, so I can't move anything, but the wording at the top of page 36, which says reconsider allowing reduced rates in centre zones, actually what we're reconsidering is increasing them. And I read that, I thought that was a terrible thing that we needed to take out of the scope, but in fact we need to reconfirm, because we don't need to do any further or get any further data. Just ask there's 3 of those 4 we're all here today, the representatives, and I'll bet you if you ask Councillor Vorster, Councillor Taylor, Councillor Young and myself, is that working? No, it's not, because you can't get a car park in the centre zone. So there's no more work necessary there. That would be one thing you could delete from your program, or look at increasing it rather back from where we reduced it from.
I think, through Madam Chair, I think we're in complete agreement with that that position. I think what we're trying to do is to look at the extent to which we do change the rates, if that makes sense, so we can provide a. So yes, we're aware of the feedback given, as Danny said, through the engagement process and the data provided to us. I think what we want to do is make sure that the rates that we're proposing through the city plan changes are as close to the mark as possible to match the needs of the city as the land use and transport system evolves as well.
The first sentence is a double negative, which confuses.
Yeah, I'm done.
Councillor Owen Jones.
So if we could go to the list of proposed changes. So I was particularly interested in the educational establishments. So the primary and the secondary schools, the state has some type of policy in that space. Is there potential to increase to reflect the state's existing policy?
Through the chair, yes, we're aware of that policy and it is being considered. It'll be looked at as part of the survey data that we get and compared with the so we'll be looking at the survey data and the rates that the state government apply.
So I think there's 100 schools on the Gold Coast, and I think the state has successfully managed to not deliver enough car parking on 100 schools, and they don't follow their own policy and they're exempt from whatever our city plan says. So I don't disagree that it's a body of work that needs to be looked at. I just ask for the merit of that when the state has a policy that they already don't follow, and even if we end up having some type of modification, it's only ever going to pick up the non-government schools. So I'd just be cautious on that. In regards to the comments made regarding page 36, I think that it is just poorly written, because what you're actually, your preliminary advice is that we actually remove the current discounts in those 4 areas.
Should say consider allowing increased rates.
Well, consider the removal of the current reduced rates. Yeah. So, and then in regards to the residential lots, my challenge there is the 2 cars work with the slightly larger lots. The 2 cars don't work in the smaller configuration of lots, because there's less street space for families to change over time. So when you go to a 1980s type of estate where there was 600 to 800 square metre blocks and there's on-street car spaces everywhere, it clearly works, having a requirement of 2. When you go to anything post Amcourt or whatever it was called in the early 90s, and you've got all these 300 square metre blocks and narrow streets and no indentations, 2 doesn't work, because it doesn't allow for the growth of families. So in my mind, there needs to be some work done in regards to that matrix of lot size to on off-street parking requirements, and even if it means the smaller the lot then requires some review of the indentation of car spaces. So I know in Studio Village they are there and they're developed at the start, but we can't retrofit them because they end up being $50,000 retrofits because of all of the services and the like. So I think that this body of work needs to be every residential lot isn't like for like because of the size, the minimum size that we now allow. And then my final comment is in regards to local bolos. And the challenge that I see there, Councillor Vorster, is that not all bolos are the same. So some of them are have got 200 pokies and 3 rinks, and some of them are struggling with 1 rink or 2 rinks and no pokies. So I think it's actually not the use, not the sporting use in terms of bowls club. It's what are all the things that are happening within that space. So I think from memory, Club Helen Sale's got 160 or something gaming machines, and it's got a car park that probably meets the city plan in terms of numbers, but is short in regards of demand. So it actually does spill out into the off-street area. So, and then my final point is probably, so whilst it's not what the words said, I actually don't have a problem with us at least identifying some of the areas that maybe need tweaking, and whether or not we tweak them is a decision for council, but it provides us with good information to make that decision. So the city plan changes over time. I think if we go to the screen before, some of those uses are, so markets, I think we've all experienced at the moment the explosion of outdoor markets, generally in state-controlled schools where we have no say in regards to parking ratios anyway. The reduction, so minor reductions in funeral parlours and adult stores, I hope to visit neither of those. And then what's the next page? So potential increases is what we need to know. So I understand the frustration of seeing the word reduction, but I think it just provides us with information, and if we choose not to pursue further, that's a decision that we're making, but we've at least been told some information.
Thanks, Councillor Owen-Jones, and I'm in furious agreement with you there on that note, and that was my interpretation of it. If we're going to look at it all, we're going to look at increases, then we've also got to look at, we don't have additional land, so we've also got to look where we can accommodate decreases, or whether we've got a lot of empty car parks sitting outside a shop or something. So I'll go to Councillor Hamill down the line, and then I'll come back to Councillor Taylor, then Councillor Gates.
Madam, that was the last slide of that. Hey, there was just the 2 slides with the tables. Yep, cool, that's right. Madam Chair, it's very quickly just to echo what you just said and what Councillor Owen-Jones said. I'm interested in making a decision based off data. We don't have that yet, and the officers haven't got to that stage of it yet, so I get the excitement, but I'm not that excited about it at this point, because all I've seen is a couple that have been potential decreases. What I'm mainly seeing is potential increases in all the ones that I regularly hear as being issues. So I look forward to the officers getting on to the next stage, bringing the data back, and hopefully the data doing what it says and showing there's a need to increase those in city plan.
Thanks, Councillor Hamill. I'll go to Councillor Taylor next.
Thank you, and I'm curious to see what the data actually comes out at, because if you're talking to Broadbeach to Main Beach and reduction, I'm really interested in who the stakeholders are and the when and how latest the data actually is. And I can give you an example, as Broadbeach is a perfect example. We've got Pacific Fair, which we've recently had a meeting with the casino Oasis, that are now shutting off their car spots and starting to charge, because they already admit they don't have enough car spots to accommodate their facilities, never mind people that's coming onto their facilities. So we understand the charging is one component, but this has been increased because of the fact of lack of parking for the area. And I do appreciate public transport and light rail is something that's very important. But the comparison, again, through Councillor Gates, what are we comparing it to? The cities we're comparing it to their public transport that they currently have, compared to the visitors we have here as well. So I'm really interested in the stakeholders and who are actually part of that stakeholders, because the feedback I'm getting through my area is we're struggling for parking. I do appreciate the city's changing, but my understanding is we're reviewing these land uses, and if we're looking at as a potential increase, it would indicate to me that maybe we haven't had enough in previous years. And as we grow, where is our visitors and where are locals going to be parking moving forward? All I can say is between Main Beach and Broad Beach, the main section of me, there is a real impact in relation to parking. And we've got some big, high casino, your Pacific Fairs, your major organisations that need to be part of these conversations as well, because we have had stakeholders meeting ourselves to discuss the challenges of how does not only workers get in and park, but how does visitors and guests get in the area. So I'm very interested to see what that data looks like moving forward. But again, really interested in who the stakeholders are in that input.
Thanks, Councillor Taylor. I'm going to go to Councillor Gates, and I think we should be done then.
Thank you, I'll be quick. I note that there was a consultant or more than one consultant. This is so heavily intertwined with city plan and the assessment process. And I'll just make a comment that in the early small lot developments, at the end of cul-de-sacs, there was often centre parking in the middle of the road as well, which catered for the fact that there wasn't as much on-street parking due to the narrow frontages. That seems not to be happening anymore. And I understand the developer's desire to get the greatest possible yield, but if our officers at that very early stage could say, well, we know that we need more parking and perhaps your cul-de-sacs could include the space for 6 or so centre parks or 4 or whatever, that would just help with that capacity, because it's a bit the same as in the very early master planned communities. There were always walkway linkages through big developments that provided access to the major street networks. And so we really need for there to be great consultation between the planners and your branch at a very early stage. And I know City Plan guides it all, but when development applications are lodged, before all of the design work is done, there really should be an encouragement for for developers to address that. And I don't know whether you know, Cam, if it's still happening or why there's sort of been a shift away from that sort of on-street capability.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I just heard the land development guidelines mentioned, and like they're frequently wheeled out as being the reason. And we've probably made changes in the land development guidelines that ultimately lead to those outcomes.
Right.
So
Well, yeah, Madam Chair, so I don't propose speaking anymore, but I have attempted to capture some of the light touches that we've discussed. I've emailed a copy of some words to our Minute Secretary, and to close the debate, if that's what you want to do, I'm happy to move something that reads as follows, that the City Plan Off-Street Car Parking Rates Assessment Project Progress Update report be received and the contents noted, which does not change the City Officer recommendation, but adds a 2, that action be taken to remove the reduced rates in centre zones outside of the transport hub area, i.e. Coomera, Bundall, Varsity and Nerang, because I think that's where we're at as elected officials. 3, that the Stage 2 scope be expanded to include a suggested approach to the treatment of tandem car park spaces, car stackers and the provision of off and on-street car parking in small lot developments. And 4, that any future proposal to reduce off-street car parking rates for specific land uses or in geographic catchments be subject to community consultation prior to consideration for inclusion in a future amendment to the city plan. And basically all that number 4 talks to is asking city officers to carry out some community consultation exercise prior to the presentation of the final recommendations. So at least we've got an understanding of the community as stakeholders. I'm not sure if I've betrayed the sentiment of the room, but I've tried to capture it.
So I'm happy to second it. I've just got a question for maybe Councillor Cole. There's a what's the definition? Is that 300 or less than 400?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And I've put it in speech marks to basically signal to city officers that maybe that's an opportunity for them to exercise some discretion rather than reading into the literal words more than that's on the page.
What's it? Yeah, yeah. Yes, I am. Thank you, Chair.
May I just...
Caldwell.
I just wanted to ask the mover, just in there it said tandem car spaces, which I'm happy with. The next two were grouped together of car lifts and stackers. And I don't know whether we should just, I don't know if there was some synergy as to why they were put together, but they are...
So we can either say car stackers, comma, car lifts.
Yeah.
And then comma
I
and the
wouldn't want
provision.
that in, but...
Yeah. A comma.
Would you put a comma? Or?
I would. Stylistically, I'd put a comma.
Okay.
Because I consider a car lift.
Yeah,
Anyway.
and then it's standard practice now, Madam Chair, that these presentations be included in the minutes, I think. I was a little bit surprised that the 2 pages of information that were on the screen weren't in the report, because, I mean, they're actually critical to where the thing's up to at the moment, and then they weren't in the report. So anyway, I hope they'll be in the minutes. Is there anything else in the situation report, or whatever it's called, situation paper, that is additionally informative at this point in time, that has been editorially removed from either the report or the presentation, that you think we should know about, given the discussion we've had? I mean, I'm surprised you didn't just go, staple, here it is.
Yeah, through the chair, I don't believe there's any other information that is relevant at this point in time.
All right, thank you, councillor. So we have a change recommendation there, moved by councillor Vorster, seconded by councillor Owen Jones. If we take that to vote, all those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors, for that hard work. And Daniel, thank you for your first 2 presentations.
The clear decision at the committee. The good thing that came out of all of that was a clear decision of the committee in regards to those 4 areas, taking on board the advice that the city officers had provided. So the other stuff just informs the report.
We just needed it clarified.
With Channel 9 for us?
Yeah, or so I think the Bullies probably run something on it as well. Like, I mean, as in, and that's the downside of the agendas being published with officer recommendations without the ability of the elected reps to reflect the views of the community.
And let's avoid double negatives.
How could you say that the other way around?
I can't do it.
Councillors, item 6.3 is the Lake Months update of the ecosystem. Are we looking to have a presentation on this? Does anyone need a presentation on this? It is actually a good news story and we've come out very well on it. So I might invite Steve McVie in to give us a rundown on, and it is a particularly good news story for us. We spent a lot of councillor dollars at budget and we've had a good outcome.
And Madam Chair, similarly, I think if, seeing as it's such good news, if it can find its way into the minutes,
yes,
would be very useful.
And is that Lake Huey Months in the photo?
It's all connected.
No, it's not.
All right, councillors. We'll go to Steve if you would like to give us a quick presentation. Thank you.
the joy of having templates. Listen, thank you very much for letting me present this. As it's been described, this is a good news story. And it's not just a good news story for Lake Months, but the learnings that we've obtained from the outcomes from this project over the last 5 years, we've been able to take out to other lakes around the city. Quick background. So that is Lake Months. That is a photo of Lake Months there. The lake is about 40 years old, and it was the first lake constructed as part of the Robina Master Plan. Other lakes, I suppose, have issues with salvinia. This lake has an issue with blue-green algae, and that has resulted from three things: climate change, or changes into the climate, things like periods of drought, the expansion of the canal network and the lakes all the way around the system, and thirdly, just its age. It's 40 years old. These three things have resulted in certain changes to water quality, with the major one being specifically the shift from a freshwater lake to a brackish lake. Back in the 80s and 90s, when it was a freshwater system, the freshwater plants that were able to grow there were outcompeting algae for their food source. So we didn't have those issues. But as after the millennial drought, the salt water that ingressed in through the groundwater actually raised into that lake and then just killed off all those freshwater species, leaving the ability for algae to have no competition for that food source. The other thing, over the 40 years, it's been receiving sediment building up through the bottom of that lake. The sediment itself can actually release phosphorus back into the water column, which is the food source that the algae need to have. So it's like safe, self-sustaining sort of lake that can actually produce its own food source. There we go. So last year, I presented the outcomes from our multi-criteria analysis. The MCA looked at 31 different options, with the top ones that came out of that were the gully baskets, the emergent plants, and FOSLOC application. Over the last 12 to 16 months as well, we've drafted up a draft lake management plan, which is provides us like an operational framework for the management, the ongoing management of the lake and its associated assets. Also, in the last 12 months, with our ongoing community engagement, we've swapped over to community information sessions. We held 4 last year. We received really good feedback from the community that moving forward, that is the way they would appreciate us moving. And we've got 2 more at the end of this year where we will present that draft management plan. So why is this such a good news story? And what has created the good news story? So the first one are gully baskets. I like to think of these as the hidden champions of this story. They sit beneath the road network in the stormwater system, and on average they prevent, at this lake in particular, about 4,000 kilograms of material from entering that lake every year. These 72 gully baskets were actually installed back in 2014, but we learnt pretty quickly that they worked. So we now have either these devices or very similar GPTs based around 23 other lakes around the city. Last year, we looked at the data, and it prevented just under 6.5 cubic metres of sediment, organic material, which is your grass clippings and your leaf matter, from entering the lake, as well as just your general litter as well. So the sediment and organic matter that didn't enter the lake, it's a good thing because that would have just broken down to produce more food source for the algae to grow. The second thing that is for this good news story is emergent plants. So basically reeds that sit around the edge of the lake. I call these the quiet achievers because they sort of just sit there and they help by stabilising the foreshore, preventing erosion. They also capture sediment and organic material that flows off the parklands into the system. They also provide habitat for birds as well as fish under the water, and the fish actually, the small little fish and other critters, can actually eat blue-green algae. So creating that healthy ecosystem where the lake becomes more self-sustaining. The problem with Lake Hugh Munce and other lakes that we have around the city is that the foreshore is actually quite deep. It ranges from about 1 foot to 1.5 metres. So you just can't get in there with a shovel, dig a hole and plant some plants. So we used a floating excavator to get in there and actually remove some healthy reeds from an area and then put it onto a floating conveyor belt and move those large root balls over to an area where there aren't any plants and dump them in. Really good success rate on this as well. We had about a 95% success rate. Within 3 to 4 months, we had birds nesting in there. And just over the weekend was the Aussie bird count, which one of the local residents actually chose this location to undertake their study. And in 20 minutes, they counted 92 birds over 14 species. So, yeah, it's providing extra habitat for those creatures. Sorry? Oh, there were a couple. Yeah.
Chair, are the reeds planted around the perimeter of the lake to stop phosphorus getting into the lake, or to...
A little bit, because it helps prevent, like when the sediment comes in off the park or the grass clippings come in, it actually gets captured by those reeds. And then as it breaks down, those reeds are there to take up those nutrients. So instead of the nutrients sort of ending up just out in the water column for the algae to eat, it helps by that process. And it also helps bind the sediment.
Would that help at Robina rather than the harvesting we undertake?
No. And it's a funny thing, sorry, Madam Chair, but it's a funny thing, the Salvinia is actually extracting a ton of nutrients from the water, quite perversely. Isn't that right, Madam Chair, through you to Steve?
That's correct.
Yeah, so the Salvinia does the job of taking out the enriched nutrients.
But then you've got to remove the Sylvinia.
That's right. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all right. And just to answer your question as well, at other lakes where we have shallower foreshores where we can go in and plant easily, we do that all the time around all of our lakes as well, and make sure they have those plants.
Is Robina deep?
Sorry?
Is Robina deep?
Not as deep as this, but as Steve said, this was the first one. So this is the old Robina Parks before it was carved off, stage 1. I mean, the issues that we have got are a little bit different because this is effectively locked. So it's the seepage of, salt water from the canals that are driving a lot of the dynamics. For us, most of our lakes are glorified stormwater treatment systems. And right?
Healthy ecosystems, stormwater treatment. Yeah.
So we tend to battle the weather. We tend to battle heavy rains washing crap into the system. And we also tend to battle rock-armoured embankments or embankments contributed by developers where we can't actually establish vegetation. And then we've got issues with turbidity involved in there. So I think it would be fair to say the balance of Robina's lake systems are more dynamic than Lake Hugh Munce, but Lake Hugh Munce deals with more structural issues in its built environment, right?
Basically, yeah, every lake is different. So every lake has its own issues, and depending on what those issues are is how we manage them. Yeah, that's right.
And thanks for being gentle. It's a nice way of saying no.
So it was yeah. It was so successful. We're going to continue it out moving forward, but because we don't have so many reed beds around the lake to actually harvest from, it's going to be a slow process. So we're going to, over the next couple of years, remove some more of these healthy reeds and move them around to other parklands and then let them expand, and then in future years come back and take some of those, harvest those out and move them around. And yeah, as I said, this is one of those instances where we've used it in other lakes. We did use it just recently in Robina at Lake Lamandra to remove some reeds around, and we've had some success there, and we're looking at other areas as well. So if the gully baskets are the what do I call them? The hidden champions, and the reed beds are the quiet achievers, then Foslock is the one who got all the media time. So bit of background. So Foslock works. It doesn't kill the algae. That's the first thing I want to get across. It doesn't kill algae. It just helps remove the food source, and it does this by being placed out across the top of the lake and then filtering down and then acting like a magnet to capture all that dissolved phosphorus. It comes in a granule thing, and then it's actually mixed into a slurry and then dispersed out, a bit like a fountain. Yeah. And then as it sits on the bed of the lake, it actually continues to work. Because as I mentioned earlier, the sediment of the lake can actually release phosphorus. This acts like a blanket, preventing it from being able to release. And the data that came out of Griffith University, and that's one of the photos from the from one of the sediments they took, sediment samples, they found that there was significant improvement to the release from prior to what it is now. So the question is, did FOSLOC work? And yes, it did. And I apologise now, I'm going to get a little bit sciencey. But this graph, it's a lot to take in, but it does tell a really good story. There's a few things you've got to take into account. So the green line is the toxin concentration over time, with the blue columns being individual rainfall events, and the red lines being the trigger values to close the lake for recreational use. And then the FOSLOC columns are there. So the trial that we did in 2018 was just 32 tonnes. Then last August we did 87 tonnes, which was the whole of lake application. And if you can just look at in the centre of the graph, in that January-February event we had in 2020, you can see directly after that rainfall event, we had the largest spike of of algae concentration in the lake over the period. Whereas since the 87 tonnes was applied, we've had similar larger rainfall events, and we haven't had that ingress. And yeah, so the FOSLOC has worked together with the gully baskets and a little bit of the emergent plants, but the FOSLOC has also worked by clearing up the water column and making it clear, very similar to the pool sort of situation. And that's actually allowed some salt-tolerant species of plants to start growing at the bottom, which hopefully we can keep encouraging to grow. So everything that I've spoken about, it's all about we've increased the habitat, we've improved community outcomes, and that has just resulted in, I jumped ahead. Sorry about that. So that graph, what it sort of shows as well is over the period of time that it was in that red zone, back in 2018, nearly the whole year was actually in that closure. And it has gradually gotten less. So up until the end of August, we hadn't gone into a closure this year. And then alternatively, you can see we've gone into the green level surveillance mode for the very, very first time in the last 5-6 years. And we're seeing that trend over to that caution alert as well. So that is, it's great news, yeah. And so that is allowing improved recreational use, the clearer waters, increase the habitat, and improved community outcomes, which resulted to, this is what I wanted, a healthy ecosystem for all to enjoy. And yes, that is Lake Hugh Months in that one.
It's a great outcome. It's, yeah, 5 or 6 years worth of work, and it's nice to see. I was down in the lake Tuesday and Thursday of last week before, and all the nippers are back in their training again with their groups from Nobbies and Mermaids. So it's a great outcome. Yeah.
And have the local residents been letterboxed to advise them of?
Yep, absolutely. And these boards are up all in every park in the lake now, advising the condition of the lake and how we got there. We've sent out bits of media all the way through, been working with it. So, yeah. I'm going to Councillor Peter Young.
Yeah, it is a great story and good work. Thanks, Steve. The recommendation, one of the recommendations is that there's a budget request for ongoing nutrient reduction treatments for Lake Hugh Months. Are you looking at applying this sort of treatment elsewhere, and is there a need for us to recognise that in the resolution?
Elsewhere to other lakes or in this lake itself?
In other lakes?
Not at this stage, no. That budget request is for Lake Hugh Months. So with the large level, it's not a one-time only application.
Yep.
The idea is to continually use this with other objectives to sort of keep that water quality clear. It's a lot like harvesting. We just don't go in and harvest one lake for Salvinia once and then walk away.
So I suppose the objective of my question is to tease out, could we increase the budget allocation so there's capacity to treat other lakes across the city?
There would have to be investigations into see if those lakes are suitable for FOSLOC. So certain shallow lakes that have very large inflows of stormwater events, it'll just get washed out and it'll be wasted. So actually Central Park Lake, it was used there, I think about 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit longer with the developer.
Right.
And yeah, it got washed out.
I imagine it would, yeah. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, and just to add to that, with this, it would be based on the data too, like after we continually test the lake all the time, and it's after particularly big rain events that the lake has turned, but what we're looking at is collecting the data going forward. So the first lot was 37 tonnes, and that was approximately about 100,000. I think the second lot was 87 tonnes, and that was round about the 300,000, but it's working that maybe that 87 tonnes, because it's put it back into the green, it may be something that with our data collection it might last 2, 3 or 4 years before it actually needs topping up. But as Steve's sort of presented to the residents as well, we have to continually correlate that data to ensure that you're not over-applying, but you're not under-applying. So to see it sitting in the green or just moving a little bit further forward. So we want to collect that to see how often those applications need to occur, if they need to occur regularly or not.
Because the water must have improved in its health as well. It wouldn't be as hot. The temperature wouldn't be as high as it used to be, presumably, if it's clearer.
Well, during winter it obviously gets colder, but we will be able to know a little bit more coming into summer to see if there has been, because we have been collecting water quality data and samples at this lake for decades, so that's a good thing that we'll be able to look back at.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Young. So we've got a recommendation there. I'm happy to move that one, and Councillor Peter Young to second. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Councillors, our final item is on grey paper. Are there any questions on this particular one? If there is, if I could have someone move us into closed for local government budget. So moved by Councillor Vorster. Yeah, moved by Councillor Owen-Jones, seconded by Councillor Caldwell. We're moving into closed. If we could have our live streaming off. Back in open.
Move the item.
Items moved by Councillor Owen-Jones, seconded by Councillor Vorster. All those in favour?
Can I just speak briefly to it?
We'll ask a few words from Councillor Owen-Jones.
I think it's really great that Division 3 continues to patch the missing links of footpaths. Closed.
Closed.
If only it was somewhere that used to be owned by someone else.
Councillors, we've got...
I was going to vote on it as well.
Yes, moved by Councillor Owen-Jones, seconded by Councillor Vorster. All those in favour, that's carried unanimously. There's GB items coming forward. Councillor Patterson, unless you were planning on leaving. No? Okay, so we've got 2 GB items there today, councillors, and I'm happy to move 8.1. It's been put forward by Councillor Hamill. He's not on this committee, so I'm happy to move it if I could have a seconder so he can speak to it. Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Councillor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for agreeing to move this GBI. Just very quickly for councillors that would not have a clue what the Woongoolba Flood Mitigation Scheme necessarily is. So the Rocky Point Sugar District that covers a big geographical area in Division 1 is a floodplain. Back in the 60s, the state government went about a significant drainage exercise in there to open it up for agricultural purposes, and that was called the Woongoolba Flood Mitigation Scheme. The city is the one that administers the scheme and takes care of the maintenance and operation of floodgates and all those kind of fun works. So it's a piece of state legislation, but it's a council that has to actually take care of it. Like I said, it was developed back in the 60s. We're still working underneath that legislation. It's been the best part of 15 years since it's had a review just to look at are the current policies and procedures fit for purpose? Is there a need to be looking at improvements around telemetry devices, floodgates? This is all on the back of an upgraded, an updated hydraulic model that's just been completed in the area. So it's just a chance for officers to do a broader piece of work and bring back a report to make sure that we're meeting all of our obligations under the legislation and have an eye on the future so that we can continue to.
Thanks, Councillor Hamill. Was there questions, councillors? Was your hand up, Councillor Vorster, or are you just scratching your head? Okay, I'll go to you, Councillor Caldwell.
Was it me?
Yeah.
Madam Chair, I was just going to ask, through you, perhaps to the Director, that sounds like an enormous amount of work, like massive amount of work. And I don't know, Councillor Hamill, have you had any thoughts on whether that would require external consultancies and what have you? Because it might require its own budget centre to pay for that. So I just don't want us to do something that we're not knowingly triggering a massive expenditure. Do we have any line of sight on that?
I'm going to pass over to Jeremy, but at this point in time, I think it's just initiating that scope of work. So if there was a significant budget that wasn't actually available, then we would obviously need to come back to council and ask for that additional funding.
No.
On that, Chairman, there used to be a trust for which we gathered funds for the Woongoorba system. I don't know if those funds still exist. If that's Jeremy might.
That's all right. So through you, Madam Chair. So we do have a budget for the maintenance operations of the Woongoorba flood mitigation scheme, but I suppose moving forward, I suppose we have to do a bit of work in terms of the study. So the first, I suppose, recommendation is to get better data in terms of the events that occur. So like our using our flood telemetry, we'd be looking at to say, well, okay, should we put in some loggers around that area to get some real-time or some analysis about what events, when they do occur, what were the heights within the area. I suppose moving forward too is also looking at the catchment area, how's that changed? So that's work that we could do through our normal consultants in hydraulic assessments of what has changed in that catchment, and then as a result, is there any sort of parameters that need to be changed in terms of the discharge of that area or the scheme?
Councillor Gates?
I can't move anything, but I would really hope that someone can move us into closed for budgetary reasons to have a wider discussion about this.
Moved by Councillor Vorster, seconded by myself. All those in favour?
Obiter is like commentary in a judgment.
Whack the gavel.
Yes. So,
Councillor Vorster.
councillors, 8.1, we have a GB item there which we went into close to have a healthy discussion on, and also to ensure that we are in support of the correct wording going forward here, which we've managed to do. Myself and Councillor Patterson are happy with the change, as we were the mover and the seconder. I'm going to go to my colleagues to vote on this, so all those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you for your time on that. We have one more general business item. I'm going to Councillor Vorster.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For those who tuned in to Lifestyle Community, we had a conversation concerning parking rules, and what I propose is a recommendation at the appropriate committee, which should provide some clarity and some information to us councillors in case we want to press for change at a state level. And it reads that updates be made to the Comprehensive Guide to Safe and Legal Parking on the Gold Coast and the Quick Guide to Safe and Legal Parking on the Gold Coast documents to better distinguish between state and council rules, and that a memorandum be prepared for councillors outlining how the state may fetter council's ability to create bespoke parking rules in built-up areas on the Gold Coast, including on nature strips. Then, of course, once we have that advice, if councillors feel we need to make a case for change, at least we've got the information to hand.
Is there any comment on that one? It was quite well discussed in L&C this morning, but I'm more than happy to open the floor up if anyone wants to. Councillor Gates.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank Councillor Vorster for taking up the matter this morning at his committee and bringing it here. We had discussion over a period of time, and we recognise that there's not tension between community services and T&I, but because one branch is involved in making sure of council's policies and the legality of them, another branch is tasked with enforcement. And we've had a lot of complaint, many of us, about two wheels up, two wheels down parking within our city, and we recognise that this is because of the road rules rather than any council policy on enforcement. So people don't understand when they're trying to do the right thing in their community and make easier passage for cars to pass, that in fact council can't overlook that, and that sometimes there is damage to our underground networks and the like, but primarily that the problem exists because of the road rules that the state control, which requires four wheels to be parked on the road. So this will help us to create a better understanding, and thank you for the way that you have worded it, Councillor Vorster, because that's what we need to be able to do, is make our community informed about what we can and can't do and the reasons why.
Thanks, Councillor Gates. I'll go Councillor Owen Jones. All right, all those in favour? That is carried. Councillors, are there any other general business items? Meeting closed 3:13. Thank you all for your debate.